Schneid guy.
So now we're going to talk about the adrenal cortex, which is the outer portion of the adrenal gland. So the adrenal cortex is made up of 3 layers or zones. And so I have them illustrated here. The outer zone, called the zona glomerulosa, we can call that ZG. The primary hormone that's made here is aldosterone. That's a steroid hormone that has important effects in the kidney that we can talk about later. The next zone inside is the zona fasciculata, or ZF, and we're just going to say it mostly makes cortisol. Although there is overlap, it does make cortisol and androgens, but we're just, for simplicity's sake, we're just separating it and saying it's just cortisol here in the ZF. And then the inner layer of the adrenal cortex is the zona reticularis, or ZR, and we'll say that primarily makes adrenal androgens such as DHEA and DHEA sulfate and androstenedione. Both of these zones probably make a mix of both though. I have the adrenal medulla here as reference. It's not part of the adrenal cortex, but it's the innermost part of the adrenal gland. And remember, the adrenal medulla has endocrine function as well. It makes mostly epi and some norepinephrine, which is part of the sympathetic nervous system. Now, if we look more carefully at the hormones, we can start with cortisol, and the effects of cortisol are widespread all over the body. We're not going to talk about all those effects here, but we'll take a look at a couple of important effects. One is this effects on the immune system to decrease immune system activity and decrease inflammation, and also its effects to increase the plasma glucose. Actually, the name of the category of hormone that cortisol belongs to is glucocorticoid. Gluco referring to its effects on glucose. Corticoid, it's a steroid hormone that's coming from the adrenal cortex. In fact, the receptor for cortisol is called the glucocorticoid receptor, or GR. This is a steroid hormone receptor and exerts its effects primarily through the nucleus, and those genomic effects are responsible for not only these 2 effects that are shown here, but all of the other effects that we won't have time to go into here. The androgens, or we call them adrenal androgens, their effects are a little more limited. They're limited to secondary sexual characteristics, so they're important in sexual development. And there's also some effects on the skin and the hair as well. What I mean by that is, for the skin, in excess, androgens can cause increased oil production and lead to acne, and also increase hair growth in certain parts of the body, like facial hair growth and body hair growth, and in excess could even lead to hair loss on the scalp. The main adrenal androgens are DHA sulfate, androstenedione, and really these are precursors to testosterone and the more potent androgen dihydrotestosterone. In the synthetic pathway, these end up getting converted ultimately to testosterone. So you could think of these as precursors, but they do have effects on their own that are mild through the androgen receptor, which all of the androgens act through, and that is a steroid hormone receptor as well. If we look at the feedback control, so we have a feedback loop here with hypothalamus up top, anterior pituitary corticotrope right here, and the adrenal cortex with the 2 zones, zona fasciculata and zona reticularis. Without the zona glomerulosa shown, which makes aldosterone, that's a separate feedback system. So we see here that we have CRH, that's corticotropin releasing hormone, has a positive influence on the corticotropes, which secrete adrenocorticotropin hormone, or ACTH, and ACTH binds to ACTH receptors, which now exert its effect on the adrenal cortex, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. The effects here are to increase the production of the adrenal androgens and cortisol. Now notice that the adrenal androgens here, they do have their effects, but they're not connected to the feedback loop. They don't connect to the hypothalamus and pituitary, but cortisol does. So it exerts its effects through its glucocorticoid receptor, which are also found in the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, where it now is responsible for exerting negative feedback. That is, activation of those glucocorticoid receptors in these locations will suppress CRH, and ACTH. A couple of important points about ACTH. ACTH, the way it's synthesized is very similar to melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH. That hormone receptor on skin melanocytes is responsible for skin pigmentation. When ACTH is in high levels, it can lose its specificity for the ACTH receptor that's found on the adrenal cortex here, and now cross over and activate these other receptors that it normally doesn't bind to, and result in skin hyperpigmentation. And that is a very important consequence of elevated levels of ACTH. Another important point is that ACTH is trophic for these layers of the adrenal cortex. That is, stimulation of the ACTH receptors on the zona fasciculata reticularis maintain the gland size of those two zones. So if I have excess ACTH, these layers can become hyperplastic, increase in size, and if ACTH is absent or reduced, the adrenal cortex layers ZF and ZR will become atrophied. And these are clinical scenarios that do come up, and there's syndromes and diseases that do result in hyperplasia of the adrenal cortex or atrophy of the adrenal cortex, and you have disorders that can lead to skin hyperpigmentation from excess ACTH. So these are all very important considerations when we start looking at medical applications to this feedback loop.